The Margolese multiple dimensions is most distinctive for its emphasis on design that makes a difference in the lives of people and to the role that design plays in addressing the issues of our times, issues of social justice about enabling populations who benefit from some design intervention on their behalf. And it's also speaking to environmental themes, of which climate change is certainly the environmental theme of our generation. It's a cash award, a $50,000 boost to a career. It has an instrumental value, you get money and you get exposure, but it also has indirect value in kind of understanding that what you're doing is important, perhaps giving a kind of sense of confidence that there's an audience and that students are interested in your work and that they will be changed by it in positive ways. Our winner this year is Nina Marie Lister, who we think speaks to a particularly important intersection of design and public policy, a sense of civics and civic policy, but also a sense of creativity, that there's joy to be found in creating beautiful infrastructure that empowers the lives of cities and people in ways that only, I think, design can do.
You know, one of the most magical places to be in a living system, in an ecosystem, is at the edge. That's where interesting things happen. At the edge of a forest where it meets a meadow, where light gets in and where energy flows, literally. Those edges of an ecosystem are a good metaphor for how I want my professional life to work. I want to be on the edge where the change happens.
She's a serious scientist. She seriously values the idea of design and its different set of metrics. She's rare in that way.
What Nina Marie's really good at is you can take a bridge engineer who normally just deals in concrete and pair him with a biologist and a landscape architect and start seeing our infrastructure differently.
What we realize about the climate crisis, for example, or biodiversity loss, is that it transcends different disciplines. It's an ecological problem, a social problem, and an economic problem. That means that the tools of those specific disciplines aren't sufficient. It's not that they don't work, it's that they are not sufficient to do the job of meeting those complex and intertwined challenges. So interdisciplinary is actually about working together to create new knowledge. And for me, the most exciting part of that next step is transdisciplinarity. And two disciplines come together to create common understanding or shared meaning. That means that we sometimes need a new language of understanding. It means that we need new tools to help us solve those problems. It's actually deep work. It's working through the disciplines to create something new. And that new quality is where innovation happens, and that's where new solutions to these crisis problems will present.
She understands the conversations that designers have, but she can also talk to ecologists and others.
The interdisciplinary approach to collaboration that she takes in her work, I think it's reflected in the philosophy of the Ecological Design Lab.
Ecological design is, in a very generic form, designing with the fabric of nature. But more specifically, it is actually an art and a science. There's a kind of compassionate quality about ecological design because the material is the material of nature. It's the material of the world that sustains us. I've recently begun recognizing explicitly a trajectory of my work is design activism. Activism, through the realm of design, is thinking, making, and doing for a difference. And it's working with communities in their places to carry that work forward together.
You know, she has this incredible sense of social justice and what's right. And I think she brings it to her students, she brings it to her research, and she just is brave, bold, and courageous.
She's clearly inspiring that next generation of students, next generation of people, but I think also in the advocacy work that she does and demonstrating through advocacy how somebody trained in planning, design, ecology, policy, environmental science can actually have real impact on the shape of cities today.
The prize is such an honor, of course, but it's also a deep affirmation. It's affirmation that this work is valid and useful, that it has benefit to people, and that, frankly, that others see it is kind of revelatory for me. One doesn't do their work expecting a prize or to be recognized. That's a huge bonus when that happens. There's no question that a prize that it comes with money means time. And the ultimate gift of the Margolese Prize is space and time for new creativity, which means new collaborations on projects that matter in places that matter.
We need more leaders like Nina Marie Lister, desperately. Her approach and her method, I'll say her enlightenment, has started to transform in our society. Her passion for working between the fields is what is her true stroke of genius, and how she will be one of the most transformative voices of the 21st century.
Good evening, everyone. I am Ron Kellett, and I am Professor and Director of the School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture, SALA, at UBC. And on behalf of the faculty, staff, and students of SALA and the Faculty of Applied Science, welcome to this celebration in honor of 2021 Margolese National Design for Living Prize winner, Nina Marie Lister. I will introduce her shortly. Welcome to you, our live audience in the auditorium of the Vogue Theatre in downtown Vancouver, and also welcome to a global audience of a few hundred watching us online at this moment. SALA holds deeply held values of community, social justice, integrity, collaboration, and ecology in the service of design for people, place, and planet. In the spirit of respect, reciprocity, and truth that accompanies those values, we acknowledge that the place on which we gather today is on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, Stolo, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Others join us virtually from other near and distant nations across Turtle Island and across the globe. We encourage all of you to take this moment to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples and territories of the places from which you join us today. SALA is very grateful to the Faculty of Applied Science, whose support and advocacy in enabling SALA to define and manage the Margolese Prize has been so valuable to us and our communities. I'm very pleased to invite Applied Science Dean Olson to offer his welcome to the evening and congratulations to our winner. Dean Olson.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Ron, for that introduction and for inviting me here tonight. Awarded by the Faculty of Applied Science through the School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture, the Margolese National Design for Living Prize is a $50,000 unrestricted award that features only two criteria. The recipient must be Canadian, and they must do outstanding work in the field of the built environment and the people within it. While this is a seemingly simple description and criteria, it has really allowed us to look across the complex, urgent problems that face the world and find people who are using design to address them in innovative and inspirational ways. The Faculty of Applied Science at UBC is a unique constellation of disciplines. Includes engineering, nursing, planning, and of course, architecture and landscape architecture, and encompasses the entire human-centered built environment. What unites us is our dedication to the thriving, sustainable, and healthy societies. Our work takes on many forms, and the Margolese Prize reflects that, celebrating design leaders across many fields. As the prize relaunched this year after taking some time to refine the values of the prize, SALA called for nominations of those who work to enhance social, cultural, and ecological well-being. From a field of over 50 nominations, the jury selected Nina Marie Lister to the new phase of this prize, inspirational, collaborative, and incredibly relevant. These ideas are at the core of what we do in the Faculty of Applied Science. As you'll see tonight, Nina Marie's transdisciplinary research and practice shapes the strategies and solutions that connect people to nature in cities. On behalf of the Faculty of Applied Science, we congratulate Nina Marie Lister as the recipient of the 2021 Margolese National Design for Living Prize. And I certainly look forward to learning more about her work tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dean Olson. Joining us in the Vogue audience tonight are some very important people who deserve our thanks and recognition. This year's selection jury was amazing. Accomplished, knowledgeable, thoughtful, and intellectually gregarious and generous people. Prize nominations were of exceptional quality, and the jury discussion of the candidates and their alignment with the intentions and opportunities of the prize were extraordinary. Thank you for the intelligence, effort, integrity, and goodwill you brought to this crucial task. I'll cite them individually and then ask them to stand for a moment and accept our appreciation. Erin Betsky is the director of the Virginia Tech School of Architecture and Design, as well as a well-published author and critic of architecture, art, and design. Claude Cormier is a landscape architect and founding principal of Claude Cormier and Associés, based in Montreal, Quebec, an internationally recognized practice known for their innovative, playful projects that expand the notion of landscape design. Mari Fujita is an associate professor and chair of the Bachelor of Design program at SALA. She studies the spatial and cultural effects of globalism and emergent forms of urbanism. She maintains a design practice, Fubulabu, and a product design practice, Maiko Brandu. Emma Peter is a photographer and principal of Emma Peter Photography, which was recently named one of the top 5 architectural photography studios in the world by Architizer. She is also the winner of Canadian Architects' inaugural Architectural Photography Award in 2019. Tudor Radulescu is partner and co-founder of the Montreal-based multidisciplinary architectural firm Canva, noted for being at the forefront of thinking, imagining, drawing, and constructing collective space. Canva was recognized with the RAIC Emerging Architectural Practice Award in 2015, and in 2017 won the Canada Council's Professional Prix de Rome in Architecture. If the jury could, who I think is in my foreground somewhere, if you would stand and be acknowledged, I would appreciate that. Thank you again from all of us at SALA. Our program this evening is rich and full, and organized in 4 segments. First, we will hear from Nina Marie Lister, who will introduce her ideas, her methods, and her work through a short presentation. Following that presentation, a panel of guests whose ideas, methods, and work are connected to those of Nina Marie will join the program. This segment will be moderated by Mary Rowe, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian Urban Institute and a leading urban and civil society advocate. Mary will share some of that background with us when she introduces our 3 other guests, Jill Anholt, Julia Czerniak, and Kees Lokman, later in the program. There will be a brief moment where we will move people around, and we'll get on with the program shortly after that resolves. A third program segment will formally present the prize, and a final segment will be an opportunity to mix and mingle in the auditorium to the extent to which one can these days with Nina Marie, the Margolese jury, and today's panelists. Now I will introduce Nina Marie. My introduction to her will be necessarily brief, as we have already learned much about her through our introductory video. However, some background might be helpful context to supplement that. Nina Marie Lister is a professor and graduate director at the School of Urban and Regional Planning at Ryerson University in Toronto. She is a senior fellow of Massey College and a visiting professor of landscape architecture and urban planning at Harvard University Graduate School of Design, where she will return in 2022. She is the editor of 3 books, including the highly cited The Ecosystem Approach, Complexity, Uncertainty, and Managing for Sustainability, the ASLA awarded Projective Ecologies, and the author of over 100 scholarly research articles and professional practice publications. As founding principal of Planform, Nina Marie also engages in creative practice based in collaboration across disciplines, working with ecologists, artists, landscape architects, engineers, and planners to integrate ecological design with urbanizing landscapes, which, through their example and their processes, transform the ways communities have thought about and interacted with the natural and built environment. In 2006, she founded the Ecological Design Lab, Canada's first hands-on, community-based research incubator focused on applied urban ecology and design. Through the lab, she engages, trains, and supports students working directly with professionals and communities to advance research and to develop tangible strategies and solutions to complex transdisciplinary problems such as climate resilience, urban biodiversity, and human well-being. These modes of research, grounded, creative, collaborative, community-engaged practices she shares with many of us at SALA in our ambition for the Margolese Prize. We are delighted to welcome Nina Marie as the first winner of a renewed and energized Margolese National Design Prize for Living, and please welcome Nina Marie to the stage to take over the next segment.
Wow, what a pleasure to be here and in person. Is this everyone's first opportunity to be in person, or maybe just mine? This is an incredible honor, and I'm incredibly fortunate and delighted to be here, so very well supported and privileged. The first thing to say is thank you. And in so doing, I offer my gratitude specifically and my respect to the elders, past, present, and future, who keep this beautiful place, its land, and its waters. And my fervent hope is that my work and the connections we make here tonight and going forward honors them and all our relations. Well, it might surprise you to learn that I'm not actually going to talk about a lot of projects tonight. I want instead to catalyze a conversation, a meaningful and deep conversation about the future of design. And this begins with ideas that are grounded and reflected in my ecological design research and praxis, focused on resilience, adaptive, complex living systems that integrate culture and nature. You'll hear a lot about those themes. Not only integrating culture and nature, but most importantly for me, the ways of working that actually reflect those systems through collaboration between the disciplines and co-creation, what many of you will understand as design at the edges of art and science. In this provocation, yes, I'll refer to work, but most of all, I want to offer some reflection and then projection on working with and in landscapes that are characterized from the outside in, from the ground up, on a finite, beautiful, and precarious planet. Characterized by complexity, diversity, and uncertainty, the science of ecology underscores all of my work. It is at once our home and our economy. But it is also the beating heart of the human in the wild. To embrace the realities of our ecology, I would argue, and have argued, that this is to enlighten our policy, our planning, and our design with new and actually sometimes old ways of seeing, knowing, and being. The resilient living planet does not obey our rules. It calls us to hold many ways of knowing and being lightly, with compassion and with humility. I've worked with designers, I've been very privileged to do so, and to learn from them new ways of thinking, knowing, and being, and most importantly, representing. I got a call in 1999 from someone I didn't know who read a paper on complex system science that I had written. That was Jim Corner of Field Operations. And he invited me to join a design competition that we talked about. And it was an unusual competition because it turned upside down what we thought we knew about parks. And we began to map out together what a dynamic living system looked like. Not the static money shot, the image to which we were all striving that is fixed in one place, but of process living and unfolding and emerging. We didn't win the competition. I continued work like this for some years, also with Jim Corner and others, with Chris Reed, who founded STOS, and we continued to work together on these ideas, mapping ecology, projecting the processes by which living systems evolve and unfold, and by which new ideas emerge, including gradients along which interesting things happen in a living system. Sometimes even how sex for fish in a river estuary provides a life force and an energy for building a new river system. We didn't win that competition. We continued this work all along the Toronto waterfront and in other locations around the world, actually, in a number of collaborations that were rich, insightful, incredible, that taught me more than I ever thought I'd know about hydrogeomorphology, fluvial geomorphology, engineering, stability, resilience. And even so, in this example, in the Portlands in Toronto, where we had the pleasure of trying to restructure a city with a river rather than the river by a city, but we didn't win the competition. In fact, we were finalists always and learned a lot from being at that edge. And the difficulty of mapping what can't be seen in multiple dimensions that sometimes just looks confusing, but ultimately was about understanding multiple points of stability over a long periods of time and at different scales from which we're used to operating. And this was a learning experience for all of us. It allowed us to project ecology into new locations, including in a moment of crisis. And here, in the dawn of the Anthropocene, at the edge of a climate emergency with biodiversity in free fall, I would argue there is opportunity and hope in these looming crises. Isn't that weird to say? But there is. If you look, you can find it. Hope and potential in the work of ecological design, an explicit strategy of working with rather than against living systems. But this moment, of course, is one of urgency, risk, and uncertainty. It's made, of course, by the tools of modernity that cannot fix the crises they created. So what to do then on the precipice of disaster? One thing we can do is learn to see differently and understand from each other's disciplines how we see. Because how we see is what we count, is what matters. Who are we counting? What are we counting? Who matters and who decides this are ultimately profoundly political questions that the tools of science alone cannot answer, but attempt to proscribe and prescribe. Can we learn to see through the eyes of others, others that remain hidden sometimes in plain sight, or lost, bleeding away among us? Can we extend that to people, others? The othering of individual souls as humans or wildlife amounts to the same exercise. Learning to see differently is incredibly important in this moment, even if it is learning to see a city as more than the sum of its bricks and mortar, but the living land that sustains it beneath our feet, or the waters that flow unseen. In fact, what we see determines what we value, which in turn values what we save and how we relate to life and to landscape. In fact, this, for me, is the ultimate projection of where we go towards a relational ecology, an ecology of understanding one to the other. That too is a living system on which we rest. Because relating to others, diversity, to biodiversity, to non-humans, is more critical than ever on an urbanizing planet. Ecology and life itself offers insight past the pretense of stability. It compels us, actually, to let go of our resilience, or rather our reliance on the illusion of rigid control, and rather to move in step with the dynamic rhythm of a breathing planet. It means we embrace flexibility, we honor diversity, we pursue adaptability and cultivate resilience, and I'm telling you, it will surely look different than we imagine, as emerging ecologies will always surprise, confound, and probably very likely displace us. The question then comes, who belongs where? We can ask this question of wildlife. In fact, they ask it of us, I'm sure. You've heard of wildlife moving into cities, but is it also not true that cities are moving into wildlife territory? And so too with people. This question of who belongs is not a light one. It's a question of making relations and understanding connections to land, water, and life, and that all creatures need space to roam. Some, apparently, take public transit, but those are the adaptable ones, and the irony of this image should not be lost upon us, because in the wild and in the urban periphery and in the areas and lands in between where roads fragment and carve up connected, living and wild landscapes, everyone needs the freedom to roam. And on an urbanizing planet with fast-growing regions, the fastest, in fact, on a direct and powerful collision course with biodiversity, we need a different plan. One that's been proposed is nature needs half of the planet, if human beings have half or more. This is, of course, at once challenging for us. It enlightens our thinking, though, and it can so enlighten our making and doing if we perceive nature to be an equal part of our relation on the planet. And this is the new work of design, I'd argue, for a different and emerging world. It can only be co-created, though, co-created between and across cultures and disciplines. Working in these interstitial spaces, in the cracks between the fields, is where light gets in. And for me, that's where new knowledge and with it, new ways of seeing and relating emerge. So, for example, like this, here we see landscape itself as critical infrastructure. Landscape is infrastructure, is landscape. In a wildlife crossing built in Banff in the late 1990s, this is a prototype for thinking about landscape itself as critical infrastructure. Yes, the landscape on either side of the road, but so too the human-designed reconnection. It is possible in this way to invest in our landscape as infrastructure to reconnect species to habitats and ecosystems. And how do we know they work? Well, in fact, we do know they work because for years, ecologists, conservation biologists have studied the movement of wildlife on roadways to prevent wildlife and vehicle collisions, not only for the safety of the motorists and passengers, but for the wildlife too. I got a phone call from someone, that man over there, Jeremy Guth, and colleagues in ecology, Tony Clevenger and many others, who asked, well, could we have a contest? Could we build a better bridge? I think that's called a design competition. And yes, we could. We launched North America's, in fact, the world's first design competition to create a wildlife crossing. We know they work because the science tells us so, and we created a partnership for the last 12 years that has been dedicated to moving people and wildlife safely through the creation of deliberately designed performative infrastructure like this rendering and this imagination that pulls water and wildlife across a landscape and provides still another client who's interested in moving, including the human. Some of those clients for these infrastructures don't speak to us, but we watch them. We monitor them. The work of ecology is slow, and it is projective as well. These images that in this photo Tony Clevenger took while monitoring who crosses where, I don't think he ever expected that they would become so poignant and powerful, a part of storytelling, to reweave landscape through a place that had been fragmented and potentially forgotten. The monitoring and the tracking of these wildlife proved unbelievably successful, so much so that these infrastructures work when sited correctly with appropriate fencing in the right place to the effect of more than 95% in most cases of success. So this is an incredible story, but it's one piece of infrastructure, and it's also a living laboratory. I don't just mean one bridge, I mean a system of landscape connections that provide us with a living laboratory for study and for learning. And the next generation of these crossings is built on those. But this is not work that happens alone. It's intensely collaborative, where one has to learn the language of differential settlement, of geotextiles, of how to apply potentially green roofs onto infrastructure that was never intended for anything but trucks and cars. So this is a new way of doing design that's highly integrative, very much collaborative, and co-creative. It involves people who never thought they would be designing for wildlife, and for whom it turns out it's important. So much so that this work has crossed the border numerous times, back and forth, creating systems of movement and landscapes that are connected. And at the heart of this interdisciplinary and collaborative work is the revelation that planning and design for living systems must be integrated processes. These are fundamentally acts of co-creation, and these take place with multiple disciplines from which new knowledge and methods emerge. In the Liberty Canyon in California, these are ways of thinking about resilience that haven't happened before. And while the mountain lion may be the star of this show, the world's largest 10-lane supercrossing, which is soon to break ground in the Agora Canyon just outside Hollywood, this may be a model for resilience. It's also a model of teamwork, intense teamwork, and also humor. How else to learn to speak to the mountain lion? Because after nature, we need more. What of the world after nature, where climate crisis is balanced with a bleak outlook for biodiversity and human equity? Is this the post-wild, the post-human, the new normal? I think not. I know that we will live among new and novel ecosystems in hybrid conditions in which we're all learning to live with change, and that will be essential. Where that lands will not be so clear. But if we are to thrive, and I would argue not merely survive, but to flourish, we need to imagine, design, visualize, co-create these places together. And we have to do so inclusively, with compassion as much as determination. And in so doing, this means we turn to our friends, the artists. We turn to our support teams in art and in science to provide us with, yes, empirical evidence that these structures work, but most importantly, that they tell artful stories so as to engage with people, so that we can have participatory, even emancipatory storytelling in places that we remake. Here, the work by Park People celebrates that kind of engagement in place keeping, not just making. But stories told by artists and ecological designers together are also collaborations for reflecting on what we've lost, mourning what we are losing as biodiversity bleeds away in plain sight. These beautiful paintings by a climate change artist, Katrine Claessens, in an exhibit called Love Letters to the Muted World. We learn to connect ourselves to nature in cities, in places where we didn't think it existed or where it was lost, in both material and metaphor alike. And sometimes I'd say we use design as activism for change, or in this case of the Hillcrest Meadow, my own property with my family, for the right to cultivate and nurture a landscape that sustains, not just depletes life. This kind of activation, design activism, really, is the power of unlearning, or in the words of my friend Lorraine Johnson, unsettling colonial ideas, unsettling the garden, she says. But of course, we ask this question because the moment is upon us to understand the symbols that we take for granted and normal. And honestly, resistance is sometimes a part of resilience. But more seriously, so too is reconciliation. Any work that we do as planners or designers, artists and architects, any work that touches land right now, we must come to grips with the truth in the reconciliation. In my own university, unlearning our past, making place for a history that is unsettled and unsettling is critical, because ultimately we are all in the act of working in a land-based venue. Land-based work is critical. And so we start with the land. We start with the ground, from the ground up, I'd argue, where we let the light and the life get back in, to reconnect to nature from the ground up, from soil and sunlight, even if we start by unpaving, depaving, and unmaking. For our own health and wellness depend on these connections. We can start small with hands in the soil, with our kids, with our neighbors. It's not easy work, actually, doing this kind of thing. But here is what's motivating, is that in the landscapes of our future, in the urban condition, these may be the only landscapes our children will ever know. And so for our own health and heart and wellness, we need to connect to nature and to each other. But after all of this, resilience is still elusive. Adaptation takes work and flexibility takes practice. And that work is owned by no one person, not a single agency, and certainly not one scale or discipline. Complexity demands uncomfortable collaboration at times, I can assure you. And transdisciplinary knowledge is unfamiliar, it's unrecognized, and save for today, it's seldom rewarded. It's also sometimes safe to fail in that adventure. We need to try and try again, but do so responsibly at a scale that makes sense. And this knowledge, I have to say, is held by many and owned by no one. Doesn't often make for prizes. It is also the paradox of slow and urgent growth. Co-creation, to some, is deep and decidedly difficult work. It's just a lot more than working together. It's not a lot of kumbaya. It's a lot of long listening, deep learning, with an open mind, two-eyed seeing, and an open heart. It's embracing other ways of knowing, lifting collectively with hands, voices, and hearts. It is, my friends, leaning in together. It's leaning into landscape to keep our places, our living systems flourishing, and in so doing, honor the landscapes that sustain us. And for me, this is good design, co-creating climate resilience for all our relations. Thank you.
Thanks, Tamara. Aren't you freezing? Or is it just my Ontario blood is thinner, apparently?
You want to go back in your living room?
Yeah, well, exactly. That's right. Whoops. There we go. All right. I'm watching to see if the video is if we're gonna get the video link. Not until she appears, I guess, like magic. Okay. Well, thanks. I'm Mary Rowe, and I am from Ontario. You just heard me talk about my thin blood, and I'm so pleased to be here to participate in honoring Nina Marie Lister, because she has been I guess I'm allowed to take this off. She has been a pioneer in this area. When I first met her, I sat in the audience as she was speaking, and I thought, what the hell is she talking about? I mean, it really blew my mind. This is a few years ago. And she was out there promoting something that people really, as you will have experienced, and which people on the online audience will have experienced, something that a lot of people had not started to think about. And I think that's a real testament to this prize. And thank you to the Margolese family for making this kind of recognition possible, because you can see what happens when you support somebody who has been out in front of a discipline and is now attracting the Thomas Woltzes of the world and David Maddoxes and the others to acknowledge, and all of you to acknowledge how resonant these ideas are. So I'm really pleased that we have an empty chair here, but Julia is going to appear like magic to join Jill and Kees to talk about how the ideas that you heard, I thought that was Julia coming in, the ideas that you heard Nina Marie sort of start on, we're going to hear about these folks and their practice. and how they've sort of can riff off that, and then we're going to get Nina Marie up here and have a chat. So I think we're going to go in this order. I think you're next. And I'll just tell you a little bit about Jill while she sets up. She's a Vancouver-based visual artist and designer. She's from Calgary. No Calgary people in the audience? Come on, a warm welcome for Calgary. And now here in Vancouver. And she's a graduate of SALA, so Ron, she's a graduate of your program. And she's going to talk about her own particular perspective around art and design and that interface. So I'm going to ask you to take to the stage and or to the podium.
I think I can just sit.
Oh, do you want to do it from there? You want to do it sitting? Okay.
Can you hear me? Thanks. All right. So as Mary mentioned, so I'm a public artist based here. And generally my work is inspired by hidden stories, systems, and conditions I discover in a place, which I weave together into spatial installations that try to invite active engagement with the viewers. So the intention with all of the work is really to try to transcend this idea of sculpture as being an object, and to try to look for ways to connect people in a much more visceral and experiential way with the world around them. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation about transdisciplinary design, because it's really kind of rare in my field for that to happen. Public art generally is kept in a separate silo from design processes. Most times when there's public art dollars for a project, the whole process is kind of taken out, and as artists we get very little opportunity to engage with design teams, with communities, with sites. So I've been very fortunate to have a few opportunities to actually be really involved with projects all the way through in a very co-creative way. So I'm going to talk about a couple of those. So this is a project in Toronto. Mary probably knows it. Sherbourne Common, which was a park, one of the first parks built by Waterfront Toronto right along Lake Ontario. And it was in fact, the first park project in Canada to integrate a community-wide stormwater treatment facility, a UV treatment facility. A really innovative idea at the time. Waterfront Toronto had a lot of very visionary ideas about sustainability. And I was very fortunate to be part of a team with PFS Studios, Stephen Teeple, and others from the very beginning. And our team decided the design was really about this connection of water through the site, a long sort of sculptural channel that connected the north and the south sides of the site, eventually discharging this pure UV-treated stormwater into Lake Ontario. But one of the things about this design is that all of the UV treatments underground is something that you don't see, something people wouldn't understand. And so as the artist on the team, there is this great opportunity to maybe find a way to tell that story in visual form through art. And I had an opportunity to create this work called Light Showers. These are 3 sculptural elements that are really the stormwater deliver elements for that channel. So they pull the purified water up to these 9-meter tall towers. There's 3 of them. They drop the water onto a scrim, a very light translucent veil that allows people to see patterns and textures, for the water to reflect light, to see this clean, beautiful element that we take for granted. There's also places where you can sort of see a more literal story about light energy and water and how things from the ground end up coming up into these elements. And then there's also an integrated and interactive light element at night for these pieces. Essentially, there's a very kind of movement of blues and green lights, but when a person crosses a bridge over the channel, the light show stops and their movement is captured in a green light across the scrims. And there's really this idea that a single small person can affect large infrastructure and sustainability. We all have a role to play. The next project I wanted to talk a little bit about is actually a project in Calgary for Fort Calgary. And Fort Calgary is basically an interpretive center. They were planning to build a new center, and as part of that, they wanted to commemorate the original fort from 1875 that stood on this land. I was brought in because they were a little bit stuck, and they wanted to have a different idea that maybe an artist could bring. And this was the design when I came into the project, which was the idea of marking the location of the original fort in concrete, a 3-meter wide concrete pad. And then the corners were going to be corten steel with the names of the RCMP from 1875. You can tell this predated our reconciliation ideas a little bit. And so I had this opportunity to really engage over time, to speak to Blackfoot Confederacy elders, to go to the archives, to really try to understand this place and this project. And some of the things I realized really changed my way of thinking about it. The first was that this fort was never a permanent structure. It was only in place for about 6 years. It was not a fort in the sense of being a fortification. It was more of a meeting place. And, you know, it was a place, in speaking to the Blackfoot elders, you know, this idea of permanency is really different for them. And they've been around, their culture has been around for thousands of years. So to me, it seemed like a different story needed to be told here, as well as the story about the prairie itself. And this site in Calgary is one of the few places in downtown that's still left, that's never been built on. And you can still see elements of the original southern Alberta prairie in this place. So the idea I had was to try to create a memory of this that was more living, more about culture, about nature coming together, about all the people that existed on this site, all the people that came before, all the people that are there now. So I traced silhouettes of all sorts of people from every archival photo I could find, from children and women and different ethnicities, members of the Blackfoot, and created this marking. The project's called Marking, that is really, it's permeable, it's open, the prairie moves in and out of it. It catches these silhouettes almost in the way that the wind blows across the prairie grasses, if any of you have ever seen that in Alberta. You can see different figures. And really the only recognition of the Northwest Mounted Police at all is very ephemeral. It's at night, there's a red light, kind of a dotted line. But this is really to talk about something that's, you know, landscapes that continue. This is something was built, it's been erased, the land endures, and this is about culture and nature and how they come together in a permeable, sustaining way. And the last project I'll just talk about is one I'm working on right now in Eugene, Oregon. This is a project to redevelop the edge of the Willamat River and connect downtown back to the river. You can see this is an industrial site. It was the Eugene Water and Electric Board plant that has since moved. And this idea was, how do we bring the city to the river, and the river to the city? I'm working with a landscape architect team from Portland, Walker Macy, and a very large team of different scientists, biologists, etc. And the design that they came up with is really a series of, it's a riparian edge restoration, boardwalks, gathering places, seating, a way of kind of bringing people back to the river. What really fascinated me was looking at the LIDAR and bathymetric images that the team came up with for the Willamat River. And what you realize is that the existing river now has been so channelized. But if you look at this LIDAR image, you see that the edges, that there's meanders and flows and floods that have existed over eons, carrying sort of alluvial soils all over the land. And in Eugene, you can actually find really rich, fertile soil inland that is from the original path of the river. I thought that was really interesting, and we had this idea. I was asked to create a gathering space for the community at the river's edge, kind of a pavilion, if you will. this idea of kind of pulling this bathymetric data, this idea up into the pavilion, but also using the medium of water, its reflection, its distortion, the way it plays with light, bringing that into this piece. So I'll apologize for the photos because these are just, I haven't been able to see this because of COVID. These are contractor photos. This project's called Subsupra. And so what's kind of interesting about it is if you stand under that canopy, you can have the river, the city, and yourself all superimposed in one place. And it's a way of really speaking about this history and this future of Eugene.
Fantastic. Thank you. It's beautiful. Thank you. Yeah. I can already see some themes emerging in terms of what Nina Marie was talking about, how we see and how this allows you to see differently. Are we going to you next case, and then we're going to zoom into Julia third? Are we going? Julia's now. All right. Well, through the magic of modern technology, you're going to hear from Julia Czerniak, who was supposed to be here, but got stranded in Seattle. There are worse places to get stranded, and so she's going to come in via Zoom. Have you heard of Zoom? Yeah, she's going to come in by Zoom, and she's an architect and from Syracuse. Julia, I don't know whether you know, I was in Syracuse this summer quite a lot because my sister lives there, and Julia's a professor there. She's just come back from Florence. She does all sorts of interesting, she's a teacher obviously, not a professor, but does all sorts of things around built form, but also about industrial, post-industrial cities and Rust Belt cities, which I guess Syracuse is one. So Julia, I'm expecting you to suddenly appear.
Hello, everyone. I'm Julia Czerniak. I'm Associate Dean and Professor at Syracuse University School of Architecture and Creative Director of CLEAR, which is a transdisciplinary research collaborative. And I'm very, very sorry not to be joining you tonight to celebrate the accomplishments of Nina Marie, and I'm extending you my heartfelt congratulations. So I'm recording this from a hotel room in Seattle, so apologize for production value. So I'm going to pick up on this prompt of co-creation and share a few examples of what Nina Marie's work has brought to my own, and by extension the discipline of architecture, urban design, and landscape through three thematics: emerging futures, critical frameworks, and expanding resiliences. And you're looking here behind the text at Farallon Island, which is a biodiversity hotspot off the coast of San Francisco. And I'll return to that in a moment. One example of her efforts at the intersection of design, planning, and ecology that demonstrates the transfer of knowledge in instrumental ways is her work on emergent ecologies, which was an entry in the Downton Park competition. And you see the site of that here in Toronto. Now, this competition marked an incredibly important moment for the discipline, where designers were preoccupied with the transdisciplinary frames of biological systems thinking, the science of complexity, complex processes, landscape performance, and digital design practice. This coincidence of interest required new ways to envision, generate, and communicate designed landscapes. And a particular note is the highly cited diagram that you see here, called Emergence Through Adaptive Management, that illustrated the way in which this rich landscape would emerge over time. It's not an exaggeration to say that this scheme and its representational strategy spawned a new wave of imagining the role of ecology in design thinking. Moreover, it advanced the relationship between how we think about the landscape and how we represent it, and both of which inform how we value and ultimately act within it. Her work has also sponsored valuable disciplinary frameworks to not only interpret landscape practice, but also to sponsor it. In my edited volume, Large Parks, Nina Marie explores more directly in her chapter called Sustainable Large Parks, Ecological Design or Designer Ecology, how shifts in ecological thinking from perceptions of ecosystems as closed, determinative structures to ones that recognize living systems as open and self-organizing, how these distinctions affect design and management strategies. Perhaps more significantly, her essay differentiates between strategies that result in the symbolic and educational, those that represent nature, what she calls designer ecology, from those that facilitate the emergence of self-organizing ecological systems, which she calls, of course, ecological design. What is important here is not only her explanation of the radical difference of these two approaches, which she does through local examples, both Yorkville Park, which she calls a designer ecology, and Downsview Park scheme, which she calls, of course, an ecological design, but for her wish for designers to understand that there's room for both when making parks. Now, Lister's work, let me move this out of the way. Lister's work strongly influenced my own chapter in that book, Legibility and Resilience. Now, her discussion of resilience thinking in the context of design, as you can read here, expands it to a heuristic, a useful analogic tool for conceptualizing, planning, designing, and managing large parks. In this way, I see disturbance here as much economic and political as it is ecological. For me, in this chapter, a park's capacity for resilience, here the ability to recover from disturbance, lies in its strategic design of its organizational systems and logics that enables it to absorb and facilitate change, yet maintain its design sensibility. So as strange as it might be, one can understand how Central Park's separation of circulation in plan and section enable it to be resilient, and allows it to accommodate diverse and shifting desires while maintaining its identity, which is to allow people to move seamlessly through the park without interruption. So my analysis of projects through this lens, such as Field Operations Winning Scheme for Fresh Kills Landfill, which you see here, would not have been catalyzed without her work. Large Parks has had a tremendous impact on scholarship and creative work within the design and planning fields. Nina Marie's role as professional advisor in the Art Wildlife Infrastructure Design Competition, which I'm sure she mentioned earlier, is one final example of the impact her expertise has on design practice for me, for others, and for my students. I can think of no more urgent concern facing our world today than that of biodiversity loss, to which all else relates. As already mentioned, this competition highlighted wildlife mitigation infrastructure and the role that wildlife corridors can play in reducing fatality for both humans and non-humans alike. I mean, this work is groundbreaking, not only for the physical proposals, and I love this one here by Janet Rosenberg's team, but for providing also a metaphorical bridge between disciplines, the sort of collaboration essential for future progress. As I mentioned, her work has inspired my teaching, most recently in a seminar called Design, Landscape, and Global Change. I had my students confront their own plant blindness by understanding the complexity of flora in their own backyards by recording what they see in a kind of 2-foot square grid, as well as more speculative and projective work. And this is the work of 2 of my thesis students from last spring called Interface Architecture Between Species. And they're asking some tough questions, such as how can architecture transform the ways in which human and non-human species interact? How can built form help to restore and sustain the existing ecology of sites? So now we're back on Farallon Island where I began, and these students worked with resident biologists there to understand their study of birds, and one of their proposals was, they called it a hydronest, to provide fresh water and nesting space for the common mule and bird lines for the scientists. So work like this, for me, is the emerging future, and I'm grateful to have a colleague like Nina Marie to take this project in innovative directions. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Julia, I love the references to self-organization. That's the business I'm in terms of cities. And the piece that Nina Marie talked about when Jim called you and said he wanted to talk about complex adaptive systems, the article you'd written, it's all connected. Now we're going to hear from Kees Lokman, who's a Dutchman. He's from the Netherlands, and I see that you worked with Pete, so I know Pete from New York because I was there when he was there. And you are the chair of the landscape architecture program. There you go. And but you're going to talk about coastal resilience, I think, and the relationship to the landscape and the practical infrastructure pieces. And I was in New Orleans for 5 years after Katrina, so I'm ready to hear what you've got to say for sure. The stage is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. And first off, I wanted to congratulate Nina Marie on winning the prize. It's well deserved. I, alongside community members, designers and scholars, and those of you probably here in the room, and our more than human friends, look forward to continue to learn from you. And it's a privilege to be here. So I'm speaking to you this evening as an uninvited guest on the traditional and unsurrendered territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And these nations has subtly shaped and reshaped the land and water interface since time immemorial. However, over the past 150 years, there's been a lot of erasure and radical transformations in our region, and we now have an urbanizing delta with complex jurisdictional context, as well as fragmented habitats, and Nina Marie touched on this, which are critical for migratory birds, fish, and coastal livelihoods. Let's see if this is working. It should be moving the image, but either way, otherwise it will just be still. Let me see. It's all right. Imagine that there would be a sliding, the image would slide and would show what 2 meters of sea level rise would do to this area. So human-induced climate change and related issues, including sea level rise, further exacerbate systematic oppression towards indigenous communities and marginalized groups, including challenges with respect to education, livelihood, health, and reliance on ecosystem services. In order to address the twin challenges of climate change and climate justice, we need a different outlook. And as highlighted so eloquently by Nina Marie, we need new frameworks for planning, design, governance, and ways of knowing. And developing potential adaptation pathways to the climate crisis must be done in ways that fundamentally address ongoing devastating consequences of colonization. Climate adaptation must become a key vehicle for decolonization. And how we act in life and intervene in our landscape has everything to do with what we value individually and as a community. As argued here by Wolf, Alice, and Bell, what is considered successful and legitimate adaptation is determined by what people perceive to be worth preserving and achieving. And these, in turn, hinge on their underlying values and objectives. For this, it not only matters who we solicit values from, but how we solicit these values as well. As planners and designers, we need to ask ourselves, who is the project with and for? Who is doing the research? How are people engaged? Which voices are heard and at what point in the process? What outputs are produced and who will benefit from the knowledge? We need to understand the complex jurisdictional and regulatory environments in which we operate and develop approaches that push beyond current barriers and facilitate cooperation across levels of government, across different sectors, and across different spatial and temporal scales. This starts with incorporating community values and indigenous values in the context of multiple forms of knowledge, plural legal and political systems. And probably this visualization won't work as well, but let me give it a shot here. Imagine something would happen here and we see sea level rise and it will get over the dike and there's pop-ups with information either way. As argued by Ian Bishop, changes in the environment are crucial, but changes in the viewer can have profound influence on attitudes to environmental change. In doing so, landscape visualization can assist in the transmission of critical knowledge, spatial knowledge, and this in turn can positively influence changes in social and cultural practices and strengthen adaptation planning and policies. Designers can also use visualizations to explore the potential implications of decision making and attitudes over time. For example, we have used a scenario planning method to explore what the Fraser River Delta might look like based on different attitudes toward nature-based solutions and foresight. All of this should help us move away from implementing solutions that lock us into specific adaptation pathways, which may limit adaptation futures. This means looking beyond dikes and seawalls as a primary solution to protect against rising sea levels. We need new ways of living with water, and this requires conversations as to how much water, when and where we are willing to accept, and what we are willing to sacrifice to undo the harm caused to indigenous communities and to improve the health of our ecosystems. And all of this, I would like to believe that designers can play a key role in capturing the collective imagination through co-creation and collaboration to develop alternative visions for the coastal areas we inhabit. I would like to leave you with this quote by Leanne Betasomasake Simpson, who encourages us to go outside, learn from the land, to talk to the people of the land, engage in the process of coming to know the land in different ways. And Nina Marie has given us much to think about in this respect, and I'm grateful for this opportunity to share my few cents as part of this endeavor as well. So thank you very much.
Okay, so are you going to come up here and join us, and we'll have a bit of a chat? And are we going to get Julia in by Zoom or no? Okay, good. And we'll just blow some hot air on each other up here because it's freezing. So it's interesting, this point that we just had. There she is. Hello, Syracuse in Seattle. I don't know whether you can see us, but we can see you. You look good there, Julia. We can see you on the screen. So, Nina Marie, you just heard these takes on sort of riffing on your ideas. I'm interested in the sort of themes that we started to hear there about, and I want to just start with where Kees was, land as pedagogy. This idea that we need to learn from what we're seeing. Tell me why we don't do this. Why isn't everybody thinking and talking like you guys are? First to you, Nina Marie.
Well, I think we could, in the whole audience, count how many people have heard the term land use. If you're a planner, right, you take a fundamentals course called land use. If you're an economist, you learn about the highest and best use of land, which right, is to build something on it. And that is, of course, the colonial project, isn't it?
So we've instrumentalized
yes,
land.
And to see the land from the top down, the Cartesian grid. We see it only as something to extract. And of course, Canada is a master extraction nation. The colonial project is at work. And in more than that, too, it is embedded in our way of understanding everything. And what we count is all on the assumption that land is to be used for something else and not valued for what it is.
Mm. Julia, what's your take on that from the U.S.? interesting for me. How many of you are actually how many of you are from a faculty? Hands up if you're a faculty. Not that many, actually. So there's a lot of non-faculty folks here, just saying. This piece of how do we actually start to think in an integrated way, Jill, your work is about this. You're trying to get people to see things quite differently. And I'm curious, as you've been trying to develop those projects, how easy is that? I bet you make it look easy, but I bet it isn't, right?
It isn't.
In practice.
Yeah. Well, I think these days, so many of us are wandering around looking on our phones, just, in our own worlds, and we don't notice. We don't notice where we are. We don't notice the land. We don't notice what's happening. And I think public art or art projects have a way of kind of disrupting that moment, giving it's something that, when you can create something that is unexpected, it makes people pause and maybe become aware and then start to maybe ponder or think or have questions. But it seems like we need to shake things up a little bit. People get used to seeing the same things. They stop noticing what's actually happening.
It's interesting. But somehow your collective work somehow is connecting us to a place. Like you're trying to, I hear when, Kees, you're talking about life or death situations. If your animations had worked, I've been in those landscapes, so I know what you're talking about. This isn't a joke anymore. So if we're not actually connected to understand what the implications are of the landscape we're in, we won't be able to live there, right?
Yeah.
How do you actually start to create that interdisciplinary incentive then that we have to work across these silos? Do we think, have we got enough urgency?
I think there's enough urgency, and I think people know that they have to work together, but I think how to get everyone involved in the conversation at the moments they need to be involved, I think that's a big question that we haven't really figured out. And so when do we go and solicit community members, like really important opinions and their values for what how they would like to see their future, but also kind of how do they see the urgency of climate change, because I think different communities will respond differently to that. So I think the idea that you have a set of values and you would just map that onto any community as though they would respond the same, I think that's a challenge, but we often approach projects that way.
But Julia was just saying that even within the university, you can't get people to work across disciplines, and Nina Marie's making a call for co-creation, which isn't just professionals in schools, it's regular folk, right? I'm interested in the community work that you've been doing, and you're saying actually other species are to co-create too. So when you're in practice, Nina Marie, and you're throwing these ideas out, and you started your talk about all our relations. Which relations? Where's the influencer that you're going to prioritize when you start a project like this? Like, who do you need to move first?
That's the key question. And of course, when we approach that question with a kind of deterministic and hierarchical perspective, we always get it wrong. The interesting thing about the wildlife crossing projects for me was that there were two priorities there, and they were arguably conflicting. In fact, they were colliding physically: the safety of wildlife and the safety of people. And it is design and storytelling that actually got that story right. That is to say, it wasn't just about removing the wildlife from the road, but actually providing safe passage in different locations at different times in different scales, under, over, and so on. And it wasn't a matter of prioritizing, but rather, one might say optimizing, or looking for both and rather than either or, which is of course a kind of basic tenet of systems thinking. We don't always make hierarchies. We think of whole systems and how they work together. But one can't do that if you're trained only at one scale and one discipline.
Yeah.
And the art piece is so important because it provides a way of seeing beyond what the disciplines that rely on empirical evidence that is told as the whole story is insufficient. It's not wrong, it's just not sufficient alone to solve the problem. So the art story helps. We think we all know that the climate change debate, if that's such a thing, how did we turn it into a debate? The facts are very clear, but yet actually people aren't interested in facts. Tell them a story with experience where they learn to see land or climate differently, and you have a different set of understandings.
I mean, I wonder if some of this too is that you were talking quite hopefully, all of you, about that there's a way out, and I think that part of the dilemma that I feel, I'm a layperson, I'm the untrained person here, is that you can get overwhelmed at just how hopeless it is. Like there is no solution. So when I see those wildlife crossings and that they actually work, or that when I see multiple lines of defense on a coast and I say, oh, that actually can absorb that, or I see your art pieces which actually can make infrastructure functional and also beautiful. I mean, I'm wondering if, Julia, I want to come to you. Is it incumbent on universities to try to break these silos down? Can you start to teach? Can you rip it all up and start to teach people across the faculties and across disciplines? Is it possible?
It's possible. It's, it comes down to things like getting your professional curriculum in, who gets the revenue for your tuition. I mean, there are so many issues to solve in order to make that happen, but I think it's going to happen. So yeah, I mean,
what would make it happen?
Well, urgency, as we've been talking about. But I think that it requires a vision to imagine what that new way of working would be. It's leadership and it's resources. So it's we're talking a lot about seeing differently. Having visions, whether it's visions of new curriculum, co-curriculums, transdisciplinary curriculums, but we also have to have leaders and we have to have the resources to do it. So I think it's that triangle that could be a way forward.
So in the institution, the academic institution is one domain. Jill, you're working in business. You're dealing with developers. You're dealing with municipal governments. And you're actually making it tangible for regular folk to see it.
Trying to, but those opportunities for artists are rare, as I kind of mentioned. And I think one of the key things is how do you get artists involved in these projects early and throughout and give them the agency to actually do work? It doesn't happen. Art and artists are kept, in this whole other...
They're sort of off to the side.
Yeah, I mean, typically in these large projects, there's the design is happening, the public engagement is happening, and the art process is over here, where they're, stick something on this X, and you've got a month to do it, and no, you can't talk to the design team, no, you can't talk to the community.
So designers are instrumentalizing artists there.
Yes.
Shame on you people.
No, but actually, I mean, it's actually not their fault because the money is tied to art, so there's a process tied to that. It has to go through policy, I think. And some of I'm losing my voice a bit, the projects I showed are because of really visionary clients and really visionary design teams who said, okay, we don't have necessarily an art component, but we're going to bring an artist in and just see where it goes.
So how come, there are projects where these guys and gals have won the day. I mean, I mentioned Pete, I mean, the High Line is an example of where the designers, and that was interdisciplinary, and they were able to convince people, let's take this old, aging piece of industrial infrastructure and do something. What was different about that case? Why? We do have some banner examples. Does it help that it was in Manhattan and there were rich New Yorkers able to?
Yes, the revenue. I mean, I think it had a lot to do with it.
Oh yeah, there's that.
Friends of the High Line and enabling it to happen. Yeah, for sure.
It helps. Money helps.
It
Go ahead,
probably
Kees.
helps also to have good clients that know what they're looking for, but yeah.
Yeah.
Wasn't it done as a competition?
I don't know, actually. Was it done as a competition initially, the High Line?
I think so. Yeah.
I believe it was, and I think that's another thing that isn't happening enough. Design competitions where they're open-minded, where they bring creative ideas, and where big projects actually are chosen, through that process.
Well, and you've pushed the envelope with a lot of competitions. A lot of the pictures you showed, Nina Marie, were competitions.
And
right?
lost all of them.
It's always the best entry is the second prize. We all know that. So the second placed.
Well, I do want to say something about that, in that we are so afraid of failure, and that may seem ironic coming on this moment at a stage where you're here to celebrate this reconceived prize. And I won it. What happened? I'm used to getting, the notice
Second.
that we didn't win. It was Loser will be the name of the book. I said that at lunchtime. Chris Reed and I joke about that. But, learning comes through failure, of course. We learn this. We tell this to our children all the time. But I have to tell you, no one institutionally rewards you for failure. And yet, Julie and I have spoken about this before as well, that we need to experiment in design in ways that are safe to fail, at a scale that if all is not lost when it doesn't work out. Why? Because it's an urgent time where we don't have a single expert that's going to solve the problem. We need to try new things together.
So can I ask you about scale on that? Because I feel that one of the dilemmas that we've had, we talk about COVID put cities into this global pilot where suddenly we were trying stuff. And I'm wondering if some of it is, can we make it smaller? Can we take risks to make it a bit smaller?
That's safe to fail.
Say it again?
That's safe to fail.
Okay.
I mean, engineers don't like that expression, forgive me for the engineers in the room, but you're doing something different when you're building a bridge. There is a fail-safe approach to that design, but with something on a small scale, and sometimes it's not even spatially small, maybe it's with a few people or with a prototype, or maybe it's putting something in place in a way that if it fails, it's not dangerous. Those are important things to learn from, and that's actually part of what we learn from design competitions or prizes that we don't win. We test new ideas in a way that extends our thinking with new partners, and we don't have time to sit back and do research in the old ways all the time. That doesn't mean we throw that out. It means we experiment with new types of knowing and seeing and counting, for example.
Well, we've had 18 months of knowing and seeing in a whole different way.
We've counted a lot, haven't we?
Yeah, I think so. So in the time that we're remaining, I see the time clock bouncing away here. I'm wondering if each of you could comment a little bit on what you would say the priority needs to be as we emerge, as we build back differently, better, whatever. Do you have a sense of how, what kind of priority would you establish, what would the priority be that you'd establish in this moment that is feasible? You first, Joe. It's a little question. Come on.
Can I go second?
No pressure.
I really believe that more opportunities have to exist for these co-creations, these co-collaborations that are not existing now. I think it's a time to experiment, as you said, a time to sort of break open things and take chances and push things. And there are just very few opportunities for that to happen right now. So I really think it's a time for that to occur.
Julia, what do you think?
Well, as someone who's worked on large urban landscapes for a decade, I'm coming around to starting small, to a little plot in the backyard, to your community, to your neighbors, to understanding the way they see and what they see. And, I was really happy to hear Nina and Ray talk about hope, and it evoked for me E.O. Wilson talking about hope. And I feel it, but I'm really glad you asked that question about scale, Mary, because I really think that working from the ground up is a way forward.
I remember years ago when Jane Jacobs was still alive, and, there were all these people pushing in on her to suggest that, you've got, it's always the city against rural, it's pitted against here, and that you have to be for nature or you're for the city. And she found herself in discussion with people like Wendell Berry, and she used to say to Wendell, we had a conversation with the two of them, where he said, I just want an agrarian sensibility. And she said, yes, and I want you to understand that we are all connected, that we're not separate, that people and cities aren't separate from nature. And I'm interested whether or not, she's been dead 15 years, so whether or not we're advancing to it. Kees, what would be your priority?
I'm going to dodge the question maybe
and,
a little bit.
And answer another one then. Go for it.
I think we need to have further discussions around resilience, because I think in many ways, the way that I'm seeing resilience being co-opted right now is another way of doing the status quo. And so a lot of cities and a lot of ways there's just maintaining what we have, and to enable to bounce back for any kind of thing that's happening, like whether it's like a fire or whether it's a flood. And I think that's not the point of resilience, but I think it's a critical discussion that we need to have, because otherwise I think we're just perpetuating the issues that we have and under the disguise of resilience. And I think that's a major issue that I'm seeing, and so love to maybe hear Nina Marie's take on that as well.
Yeah, we agree in this. Resilience, of course, is the art of learning how to change, not passively being changed. And it's not, of course, bouncing back. It's bouncing to a state that we can all agree is acceptable. And it's usually not normal. It's what we now call the new normal. And what did we learn? You asked the question, what's the priority? It's not forgetting what we learned. We learned a lot, didn't we? We adapted and did some crazy things. I mean, my goodness, in Ontario, we sold liquor at the corner store. That's crazy.
And we're not going back.
We're not going back. No, I mean, but there are all kinds of adaptations that happen when you think about it. I mean, I love the uptick in bird watching because people were stuck at home, supposed to be on Zoom, but looking out the window. I talked out the window a lot. I don't know about the rest of you. And people learned to see things that were hidden in plain sight out their windows. Let's not forget that. You know, I think I had to be reminded 8 times to take my mask off when I went up on stage because it's taken me a year to learn to put it on. But there are adaptations that we've done at every scale that have not been easy or equitable for sure, so I'm not making light of them. But not forgetting that we actually can adapt. And if we can remember on a small scale how to do it, we can collectively do it on larger scales.
And we can see, and we can pay attention, and we can measure differently and count differently and adapt, not just go back to what we were. Would you join me in thanking Julia, being piped in from Seattle, Joy, Kees, and Nina Marie, and all of you.
And we did adapt because Julie was supposed to be
Yes, and we
here.
adapted. There we were. We
And she
adapted, and
looks great on
Zoom is
screen.
here. That's right.
So much, panel. Mary, Jill, Kees, Nina Marie, and I guess our friend Julia has disappeared into Zoom land again. But thank you all. It was a kind of demonstration of performance resilience to pull that off this afternoon, and thank you for all of you. So last segment, and it's a short one. In this segment, I'd like to present Nina Marie with a memento of the prize. And we commissioned an award this year from ceramicist and sculptor Gailan Gan, who lives and works in East Vancouver and the family studio on Hornby Island. Her innovative experimental work collects materials from a range of natural and commercial sources, a process reflected in the award that she's created for the prize. Beneath a bright glaze is what Gailan has called a democratic material, clay. It's one of the very first building materials and something most people have encountered, whether in nature or through art. Incorporated within that clay are textural pieces of brick, an element of the built environment that is the focus of the prize. We extend our thanks to Gailan for creating this award, and we're pleased to present it to Nina Marie tonight. So, Nina Marie, if you would mind getting closer. And if you take one of the water cups with you, they have. So congratulations. The first ever gold tactile award.
I will not drop it.
Oh, that's not. We'll send it to you. You can hold it for a while.
I'd like to hold it, thank you.
Okay.
It's very tactile, thank you.
Yeah. And finally, a few closing thank yous. Sala thanks Inform Interiors for the furniture setting on the stage, so thank you, Nancy and Nils. And the Wild Bunch for the flowers that are at the edges of the stage here. And I would personally like to thank a few key Sala people for their many and sustained behind-the-scenes effort to make the prize and this event possible. These include Tamara Ross, Sala's Associate Director for Administration and Academic Operations, Emma Fennell, Sala's Communications and Outreach Specialist, and Sala's student, Kevin Parsons, who worked on the nomination packages and other crucial support roles since early 2021. It's been a wonderful effort, and it took a whole community to make that part happen as well. So we're about to bring the house lights back up, and we did our damnedest to try to figure out a way to have a reception, but Unfortunately, there are so many obstacles at the moment to that, but we have an option for you. We're welcome to mingle in the auditorium. And so when the house lights come up, we're going to invite the panel and the jury and the audience to take a moment and perhaps talk to one another for a few minutes. However, when you leave the auditorium and you go into the lobby, you have to exit. So please stay in here and mingle. And again, thank you, audience, for being such an attentive group, and thank you, the online audience, for sticking with us. And again, thank you, everyone. So good evening from